Welcome to the Business of Race podcast, where we discuss issues of race and racism, the impacts they have on business, and what employers can do to address these issues so that all employees have a healthier work environment. I'm your host, Regina Newkirk-Ricci, the Director of Equity for 90 Forward, a racial equity and justice nonprofit based in Jacksonville, Florida. And today, joining me in the conference room, we are traveling. We're on the road, and we are in the great city of Tampa. And we are joined today by BeverlyAnn Foster, who is an Adjunct Communications Professor at the University of Tampa, and Christopher Johnson, who is the Senior Social Responsibility Specialist for Mosaic. Welcome to the conference room.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Well, I'm really excited today. We were on a panel earlier and discussing issues of cultural competence. And I don't know that people who aren't engaged in this work are necessarily familiar with it. I think probably just from understanding how words work, you can get a sense of it. But what would you say really is cultural competence?
Well, to me, cultural competence is being aware. I think there's some there's a dichotomy to it, right? So it's me personally being socially aware of my value and belief system as it relates to my culture, but then also of others as well. So I think the cultural competence discipline, if you will, is all-encompassing in that regard. It is also, and by extension, me being a marginalized person, a black man of color. There are, aspects to my culture that I value. There are aspects of my culture that I know shape who I am. I have that self-awareness. And that being said, being a marginalized person, I realize that in converse, the belief in value system associated with others' cultures as well, and why I need to have a respect and understanding of that the same way that I would want people to have this respect and understanding of mine.
Echoing what Chris says is cultural competency for me is that awareness that I am who I am in the different lanes of culture that there are for me, but there are everybody else in the world, and everybody else is different from me. There's different cultures. They could intersect, they could overlap, but it's the awareness, it's the respect for others, and knowing that whatever space that we're in, if I can be respectful and continue to learn and pay attention to that, and hopefully have an environment that adapts so that everyone feels of equal value, then that feels, for me personally, that is cultural competence.
So as we talk about this, those sound like great aspirations and
right.
A wonderful mindset. But we're talking about employers who are trying to get a job done. I'm hiring you to do a job. I'm trying to make a profit. Why is cultural competence important in the workplace?
Well, I hate to, kind of resort to this sometimes, but in conversations that I have in different environments and, business people that I know or, key stakeholders, there's a business, purpose, and there's also a business benefit to embracing cultural competence and embracing diversity, equity, and inclusion. The reason why I am challenged with that because of my own personal value system is it's challenging sometimes for me to lead with that because, speaking to the monetary value of cultural competence or diversity, equity, and inclusion for something that I, to my core, believe is just the right thing to do, right? But that is a reality. There is a business case for it. But even more so, our environments are diverse, right? Our companies, organizations, public, private, nonprofit, are pretty reflective of our communities. Of course, not always as leadership. That's another conversation, but our companies are. And I think there's something to be said for the value system of a company, what they say that they set to do in a community as it relates to their mission. And again, the business case, there's other elements as it relates to retention and employee engagement, productivity, because on this foundation, in my opinion, people do bring themselves to the workplace. And, there are factors in the environment outside of work and inside of work that impact people where they are, from a mental health standpoint, safety standpoint, again, productivity standpoint, retention standpoint. So it's definitely multifaceted. But those are some of the thoughts that I have in that regard.
I think, obviously employers, business, they are there to succeed. But how do you succeed with a team of individuals or employees that this isn't on their radar? What is your company culture? Does it embrace this idea and really adapt the employer environment to it? And if you don't, how successful can you be? Who is applying to be a part of your company if this is no longer or has never been a part of your culture?
Right.
And I think that's a big point. So speaking to, of course, the profitability and everything else involved, but in my opinion, from my lane, it's, culture. And, does this exist there? It should. It has to.
Well, and the truth of the matter is the cultures exist there regardless of whether you're addressing them or not.
Oh, definitely.
Right?
Absolutely.
And so people have their life experiences, their backgrounds, their beliefs, all of those things that they're bringing to work with them. And if you don't address it, I think you get to questions of how effective are your teams going to be? Right? This is really about building that respect, that understanding, that perspective in the teams so that your teams actually are more functional. And then again, going back to profitability, I think, that's right there. So if we are talking to employers about doing this cultural competency work, what would you say is step one? Like, what's the first thing if I own XYZ business? What would you say is the first thing that I need to do in trying to address issues of cultural competency or build cultural competency?
Yeah, take the temperature, right? I would take the temperature of, I know the cliche is the room, but, certainly companies, organizations are of different size and such. I would take the temperature. There are many resources that exist as it relates to really identifying where leadership is with their cultural competence. That is key to this work, as well as diversity, equity, and inclusion in general. I know they go hand in hand. Leadership has to be bought in. Leadership has to be, dare I say, champions, if not, advocates for the work within whatever said company or organization, regardless of size. So I think it's really important for them to take the temperature first and foremost of where people are. You could also maybe say that's gauging the appetite for it, but I would think that we are beyond just kind of gauging the appetite because we've already identified how important this work is to embark on and to continuously refine. That's what I would say.
I think it has to be set as an authentic priority for your organization. If it's not authentic, then you're spinning your reels and it's for show, and your employees are going to see that. Right? But if you truly have this intention, an authentic intention, then you have to take temperature, make sure, especially from leadership, that it is their intention as well. Because if it is not, it will not succeed. And then that goes back to what we were just talking about. What is your company culture? And how good is that if this is not on your radar and you are not doing work for it?
I think both of those things are really important, right? Number one, it has to start with leadership. If the leadership hasn't bought in, if the leadership doesn't know where they are, if the leadership has not set this as an authentic priority, it's going to fail. But I also think another crucial part of that, and you all both touched on it, in taking the temperature, is you have to have the data. Right? You have to know where people are, and there are a number of tools that you can use to do that, but you need to know where you as the leader are, where your leadership team is, and what's the culture of your organization. I think lots of times we think it's one thing, and then when we actually get the data, it's something else. And I think that's another issue to be aware of, is leadership you might not know all of the issues, particularly cultural issues that are going on in your organization without that data and hearing from your employees.
I want to mention something and tag on to that. I agree. So, going back to your previous question about what is kind of like the first step to take. I know I had said take the temperature, but there are probably, as we kind of think and talk through this point, multiple approaches that can be taken at the onset. Right? When you mentioned data, you can reflect upon benchmarking, right? What do our, hiring practices look like? How are we posting for jobs? What's the language that's in the jobs posting? When a resume comes in, are we redacting information that shows any information as to who this individual is beyond their qualifications and requirements for the job and such to eliminate biases and everything? What are, promotion rates like, and so on and so forth. So I think in conjunction with, taking the temperature, but also doing some benchmarking, right? Kind of looking at, as you mentioned, Regina, like where are we right now from a, internal, external, what are our stakeholders saying about us? Do they see us as an organization that's reflective of our community or that our leadership is reflective of our community in that regard? Something that I would say sometimes in various environments, whether I'm working at a nonprofit or a for-profit company, is I want to win, right? I always want to win. And I would argue that leadership teams want to win as well. And in my opinion, I know I'm have a bias in this perspective, but you're winning when you're embracing cultural competence and diversity, equity, and inclusion. There's an argument that is the foundation for innovation, really, and I would dare say even sustainability.
So, because you talk about winning, and I think that's really important, and I think that's another thing, right? Sometimes this gets seen as one of those squishy, feel good, appropriate things to say kinds of work, but it really does set you up to win because data has shown the more diverse your team is, which makes sense. The more diverse your team is, the better you're going to do. The more perspectives you bring to the table, right? The fewer blind spots you have as an organization. If people feel like their culture is embraced, their voice is embraced, and they can bring their full selves to work.
Absolutely.
If I have a culturally competent workplace, what kinds of things should I be seeing? Like what's an indicator of the fact that, hey, we have a high level of cultural competency in our workplace? What are some things that you would look for or look at? Or the inverse, if I see this, then I know that I really don't have a culturally competent workplace.
Yeah, I think there's a lot, right? So as it relates to knowing that your workplace is on the right path, because this is certainly continuous work. We could always do better. We could always refine. Is there space given with intentionality to a diverse, the diverse population that exists within your company? What are the hiring practices like? Are we hiring people from diverse, backgrounds and populations? Is there an equitable environment, right? So are there mentoring programs that exist to ensure that, people are brought along in their professional career? Some don't have the same resources as their majority counterparts, from people referring to people who are marginalized, as well as are there communities for people from various marginalized populations? Some places call them, employee resource groups or employee inclusion networks. By no means is this certainly all inclusive, but I think that those are some of the, in my opinion, what I look to when I'm looking at, where my colleague companies and organizations are in their journey for cultural competence, and diversity, equity, inclusion. Those are some of the things I look for, right? And if we are embodying some of those within my own company, bringing back conversations and say, hey, these are some of our best practices in the field that we can adopt in that regard. And I think that also asking the right questions, right? So, many institutions and organizations and companies do employee surveys or satisfaction surveys or whatever the case. I think there could be some intentional questions related to what employees believe about the cultural competence of leadership, of their fellow coworkers, what the environment looks like in that regard. So I think this is definitely multifaceted, but that's the approach that I would take, kind of talking to some of what, examples of what, positive environments look like when those workplaces and organizations or companies are on a positive journey with cultural competence.
I kind of look at it too as an external, internal glance, right? So yeah, the surveys is you can think you're doing the work, and you think you have a positive environment, but do you actually have a positive environment? So I think the surveys that Chris was speaking to, that is beneficial. Also, I think if you're looking at the company to see, is this a positive space? Are they willing to have the conversation? Can they speak to where they are on their corporate cultural competency journey, right? Because you're not done. It's not the checkbox.
Right.
It's where are you? What are you doing for employees? What are you doing for your employees? Just as simple as resources and opportunities like the, groups, meetings, just a safe space to continue on individual journeys. I think that's what a positive, corporate or cultural competent corporation looks like.
Well, I think safety is really important in that, right?
Yeah.
Because I need to be safe to be honest with you.
Sure.
It needs to feel okay that there's not going to be a consequence from discussing issues of difference.
Sure.
And this cultural competency obviously goes beyond just race. I think people generally think race and gender. Those are the first two that come up, right? But there are lots of identities and places of difference, socioeconomic, sexual orientation, generational. That's a big one.
Generations are huge.
I
agree.
When I first started my career, was really a big thing that I sounded like I was from the North, right? The Northern Southern, and I was like, that's a thing, which I did spend some time there, but for the most part, I grew up in the South. But the Northern Southern thing was a big, big thing. So even to, what state you're from or what area you're from, what neighborhood you grew up in, there's lots of places of difference, and those differences impact the cultural experience that people come. But is it safe to talk about that? Is it safe to have difference and have open conversations about it? I think those are really important indicators as well, because if you don't have that safe space, you're not going to get the honest data from the survey, and you're not going to really know where you are. Right.
Absolutely. And you have to be willing to have those conversations. And if your employees, don't know that is a safe space, then you're not doing your job. Mm-hmm. You have to make sure that this space exists so that you can have growth, you can have that proper feedback, that accurate feedback, but your success also follows along when you've done the right things.
And it doesn't happen accidentally, right? Safe spaces are done with intention.
Absolutely.
And deliberateness and consistency, right? You have to make statements. You have to demonstrate. Like you said, if leadership's not doing it, then other people aren't going to do it. It's not a safe thing to do. And you have to reinforce that message, be it in memos, be it in meetings, your format even of giving people places to make those honest statements and have those discussions openly. Otherwise, people will not trust it, and really it won't, truthfully, because it's not authentic.
Right.
I would agree. The intention is what I'm hearing you all speak to, and I agree. Intent is important. You have to be intentional. So that is also that also demonstrates, right? That's a characteristic of a workplace or organization or company that is also, doing positive work as it relates to cultural competence. I think another positive example is centering the voice of marginalized people in the work that's happening within corporations, right? Different organizations I've consulted with and support in the community, either professionally or personally, I know that I saw, after the events of 2020 with George Floyd's murder and such, many put out statements, made commitments, so on and so forth. But I was really taken aback to learn that I shouldn't say many, some of the statements that I, saw and heard and so on and so forth were, even though those environments and those workspaces had people of color that were employed there on their boards or even senior leaders or whatever, none of them were a part of the messaging that went out in that moment. So then that breeds a whole bunch of questions, right? So was that authentic? Were you being genuine? Were you doing it because it was the cool thing to do? Giving the benefit of the doubt, right? Okay, this is happening right now because you're saying it's the right thing to do, but you're lacking cultural competence in not centering the voice of those, marginalized in this moment to be a part of that messaging.
Well, and I think that goes back to the fact that you also have to have people who have been marginalized in those spaces
Sure.
to make those decisions, right? Because you had mentioned leadership earlier.
Sure.
And it becomes a lot more challenging to respond from a place of competence if you don't have that diversity of cultural experiences at the table, making the decisions, putting together those messages, determining the strategic direction of the organization. And this gets to it. I think after George Floyd's murder, I was really just going through reading corporate statements. And it was almost to the point that I could pinpoint whether or not people of color were involved in the crafting of the statement by what was said.
Interesting.
Right?
Yeah.
And it was a question of authenticity for me. And I could tell who was really involved and who wasn't. And I could also tell, so for instance, there was one organization, it was a company, they put out a statement. Now, there was very clear, it's a couple that owns this company. They're both white. And it was very clear that statement was from them. But it was also extremely clear this was not their first foray into this work. This was a continuation of work that they were doing. And they were speaking from their own experience, but understanding that they didn't have the experience of people of color, but they had empathy for it.
That's great.
Right? And I still felt the sincerity and the truth in their message, right? But again, their cultural competency is high, and I can tell it in their messaging. So I think that's another thing of understanding with corporations that people really are seeing, again, that external survey, right? Yeah. People really are reading the messages that you put out. They are seeing the work that you're doing. They're recognizing where you're spending money, and they're saying, do these things add up? Are you really coming from an authentic place? I think it's important. So I want to shift gears just a little bit because we've really been talking about this from a corporate space and what you should do in the corporation. Now I want to talk about, hey, how do we really address this as we're bringing people into the corporation, right? So we're talking about hiring practices and de-identifying, but looking for qualifications. But I think you really do want to have a mindset of hiring people who are open to, who are familiar with cultural competency and open to growing along that spectrum. What are some things that employers should be looking for when they're looking to hire people if they want to have a culturally competent workforce?
I think that's a great question. And I really have to rely upon something that Beverly mentioned a little while ago. So I will actually counter a little bit and say the employers have to look at themselves, right? So I believe, and nothing's ever 100% or perfect, right? But if a corporation, organization has established and communicates out loud that this is a value of the corporation, right? Diversity, equity, inclusion, or cultural competence on their website. When there are, town halls, if the company has those or whatever the case, it's readily spoken about and such. You're going to attract people who also, in my opinion, share those values more often than not. Also, the intentionality behind not just the hiring practice, but how and where are you recruiting for your employees and such, because there has to be, unfortunately or fortunately, there has to be intentionality in this work. So, and by virtue of that intentionality, if you are, trying to advertise your job postings or go to colleges with the intention of, being in spaces or organizations and stuff that have a more diverse population, you're going to, there are valuable and talented people of all backgrounds, right? You're going to attract those types of individuals as well. Inside, so that's the external piece, but inside the workplace is definitely more of a journey, I believe. I think it relies upon kind of what we spoke about before, about taking that temperature as well, having conversations. And I think that this phrase is kind of played out right now, but normalizing it, normalizing cultural competence, normalizing talking about race, talking about different marginalized populations. Also, look at your practices and your policies. What is your, do you have a diversity statement that's all encompassing? Gender, orientation, race, creed, ability, visible and invisible. So again, that's kind of inward facing, but still, if you are propping that up within your company and ensuring that employees know that this is ready baked into, what we believe in here, I believe that that's a sign that, a company's doing the right thing, but then also you're going to attract people who are also in line with that as well. But then again, understand that everyone is at a different part of their journey. Those who don't embody maybe some of those cultural competent and or diversity, equity, and inclusion ideals can begin their journey, ask questions, make sure it's a safe space, communicate that it's a safe space, and kind of like, conditioning yourself. It can't just be something that happens every now and then or once a year during a strategic planning session, or has to be consistent. It has to be consistent because especially for those who aren't there yet, they need to understand and realize that they are able to ask questions, provide perspectives, whether they are resolute in their ideals or not, that's fine. But they have to have the opportunity to be able to learn themselves. And sometimes those people are some of our senior leaders within our organizations and companies. And I think that something I learned from you, Regina, you said this before about, really having a sense of potentially either apprehension or anxiety as a leader, like I'm supposed to already be here. I'm supposed to already know this stuff. I'm supposed to, well, sometimes that reluctance of that leader diving into that work themselves or embarking on that journey or communicating is stifling the ability for the work to be done at a broader company level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. And I think too, you can look for individuals just by the way you interview them. And you don't have to, flat out ask what their policy is, right, as an individual. But I think that you can ask them. There's behavioral interview questions or situational questions. You can test their waters and see who you're bringing in. Did they do the research? Do they know how important this is to your organization? Have they read your diversity statement? What are their thoughts on it? Ask those questions, those first few opportunities that you have with those individuals, and you will see who is the right fit and who doesn't hold your same values.
Because I think reactions tell
right.
So
Nonverbals are my favorite.
They're the
teach
best.
Nonverbals, and they are the greatest things to
read. And it's 90% of where we communicate,
Absolutely.
Right? And if people are looking for authenticity, they're going to look to your nonverbal cues.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Because you can say anything, but if your face, your body, your voice, all those things aren't backing up the words coming out of your mouth, people are going to default to that because that's the truth. And then you're just saying the appropriate things. And I think that's really important in interviews as well.
I totally agree. And on the flip side, when you find that individual that this is a journey they are on and they are excited about it, they will show you and they will tell you, and you can feel the work and the passion that those people have. And that only contributes to that positive organization that we were talking about earlier, right? If you keep adding, you have the value add for each individual that you bring on because you're vetting the right people first. I mean, talk about growth in a safe space that you're creating. There's no better way to do it than that.
Right. So I think the first thing is you got to make sure that your house is built correctly, right?
I agree.
To borrow from the good to great, you want the right people on the bus. You need to make sure you got the right bus, right?
Absolutely.
But then, yes, you fill the bus up with the right people. Man, are you going to go some amazing places. So I think that is really, really important. All right, so I'm going to shift gears one more time.
Sure.
So again, we've been talking about all of this work happening in the organization. If I am the leader of the organization and I'm like, wow, okay, that you're right. Cultural competence is important, but I don't really know. I don't feel like I have a lot of cultural competence, and I'm the leader, and I want to be in that position of leading by example, right? And building my own competence first before. What are some things that you all would recommend people do personally to build their cultural competence?
Well, I think that there could be two approaches. There could be internal and external as relates to the company, right? The external stuff I think is super personal. The internal, of course, is specific to the company. So some of the thoughts that come to my mind from an internal company perspective is one of our sites at Mosaic, the company I work for, is in Polk County. And they embarked at that particular site on a book club. They had a book club where they were reading books that were rooted in diversity, equity, and inclusion, cultural competence, like white fragility, why all the black kids sitting together in the cafeteria. And they were talking about it. They were having conversations, open dialogue, for the purpose of just not only learning, but also giving, with intention, opportunity for some of the colleagues who felt marginalized a safe space to speak up. That was their first approach. One thing I will say about that as well, in conjunction to not just like a book club per se, there are trainings out there, of course, there are resources out there, but I encourage pure learning from that, right? Like I encourage a debrief and a conversation. It's easy. So much of these trainings, right, are like virtual. So many of these trainings are like LinkedIn has an amazing library of diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings, cultural competence trainings that you could either do with colleagues in the same space or on your own, obviously. But I think what's key and critical is the debrief and the peer learning and the shared learning of that. Great, we learned this. Now let's have conversation about it. That is where I think really like the rubber hits the road, if you will. Like, how do we make this real? How do we make this real in our workspace, in our environment, in our ecosystem here, whether it's an organization or a company? As it relates to externally, the personal work, there's a lot that could be done. I like to embrace the arts, film, documentaries, visual art, museums. Oh my goodness, museums are great. There is literally, opportunity in really through the arts to learn about literally every population, really that's candidly marginalized or not. There's a lot of opportunity out there within our communities to do so. We can, search those, of course. Again, I mentioned a couple books that some of my colleagues were reading in a book club and such, but there are a lot of films that I like to watch that really kind of give you a deep dive into certain cultures, whether it's Black culture, or Latinx culture, or LGBTQ plus culture, or whatever the case, right? There's a lot that can be done in that regard. I think that also, we know people from marginalized populations. How can I be an ally? Asking, right? I have a good friend of mine named Justin. He became paralyzed in a swimming accident when he was 13. Justin's well into his 20s now, and I've had that conversation with Justin. He is, in a wheelchair. How can I be an ally? How can I do better in supporting you as my friend, in supporting you in just like your life experience, right? And I learned a lot from that conversation. oh, I don't like when people push my wheelchair. I don't like when people feel as though I can't open doors. I'd rather you ask me if I need to have the door open. Just, in that same vein, that can happen in other matters as well. So, and I think that there are a lot of opportunities, again, as a personal individual, from a personal individual perspective. You don't necessarily need, your corporation to either mandate or encourage training for you to do it yourself. So there are a lot of resources that exist here. I'm on the board for the Nonprofit Leadership Center of Tampa Bay. Our organization, has resources such as those. There are organizations throughout the state of Florida, nationally. Literally, it can be Googled. Resources for cultural competence, resources for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Many of them are free. That can be done as well. And I would, and then also just having conversations with people that you care about, in your family, with your children, because just through the dialogue, right, and the shared, not just experience, but the shared perspectives, I personally believe I refine my own understanding of matters and the experience that other people share.
I agree. I just feel like I just keep saying, I agree. But yes, have those conversations. And if I can add, be willing to hear the feedback. You have to be willing to know that you're not going to know it all. It's okay that you're wrong, and you're going to be told that you're wrong at some point. And that's okay. That's how we learn. If you're ready to do the work and learn, your journey started.
Well, and I think the fear is one of those big things that holds people back. I mean, obviously, 904 Group, we do a lot of work along race. And I also want to say that 904ward.org has a lot of resources as well.
Fantastic.
But one of the things that we hear the most is, I don't want anybody to call me a racist, or I don't want anybody to think that I'm a racist, right? And that fear holds people back, as well as, if that does happen, the defensiveness over that. And I think that's probably one of those really, really inflammatory statements. The defensiveness over that really prevents people from hearing the feedback that they're getting as to why the statement was made, or why the statement had that level of impact, right? Again, this is intention versus impact, which is really important to separate. They are not the same. How do you get past that fear? I don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't want to offend anybody. I don't want people to know that I don't know, because I should know already. How do you move past that so that you can get to that level of knowledge and learning?
I think authenticity. It's okay to say that you don't know. And if you're in a group, whether it's in a safe space, in a corporate group where you're doing a book club or something, or you have a friend and you know that you can ask questions, ask if you can ask. You don't want to assume that that is going to be a person that can answer all your questions, and you don't want to put that on anybody either. But for me, it's coming from a real authentic place and in constant fear that I might say something wrong, but also know that I'm at a point that I want to do the work. So if I'm told, probably not the best thing, or we should address it this way, or can I give you feedback, I have to be open and willing to say, absolutely. Yeah, and I'm sorry.
Right.
No.
Like
authentically, I'm sorry that I didn't get it right, and I will do better next time.
Mm-hmm.
No, I agree with that. And even experts in their field don't know everything. So I think understanding that it's okay not to know everything is okay. It's all right. And I think that I would have to piggyback on what Beverly said about being authentic and genuine. Questions are always better than assumptions, most certainly. Understanding that we will make missteps. The perfect can't get in the way of the good. being on the journey is more important than not taking the step to try,
Right.
in my opinion.
And recognizing that everybody's on a journey.
Right.
Right? It's not that everyone's at the finish line and you're still trying to catch up or you haven't started yet. It's that everyone, hopefully everyone, is in some space or place. And the intention is there. The good intention is there is to want to know to do better.
Right. And I really do think that intention shines through, right? Even in the case of missteps.
Yeah.
I have had people say some really offensive things to me, and I know the intention was right.
Right.
Okay, so let me help you understand why the impact was not what you intended it to be. Also been in spaces where the intention was wrong and then it was very clear what was happening, right? So I think sometimes you have to trust that that comes through, but at the same time, you have to be willing to take the ownership of the impact you created, right? Again, that very authentic apology. And truthfully, you asking me, for instance, if I've been offended, it is more meaningful to me if you ask for understanding of how that was offensive so that I can ensure that I don't do that again and then apologize. That will carry so much weight with me. And I think it carries weight with a lot of people. So it's oftentimes the opposite of how you want to react, right? I want to be defensive and I want to tell you, no, that wasn't my intention. I didn't mean it that way. You take it wrong. That's how I want to react. But I think people will respect it more and you actually will grow and learn more if you say, can you please explain to me what was offensive in that statement? I want to ensure that I don't offend anybody else. And I want to make sure that I really understand what I did incorrectly.
Absolutely.
You hear it, then I am so sorry for that.
I love that you just explained the order that should go in. That's huge. Because very frankly, I think I would first want to say, I'm so sorry. But that makes it about me feeling sorry and what I did. But asking, can you explain it, is a totally different ballgame. And then authentically apologizing.
Right. And that also shows that you're on that journey of learning, right?
Right.
Right. I want to grow so that I don't
I
have
love
the same
that.
misstep. I think that's important. All right. So as we're coming to the end of our time here, we want to do a quick wrap up. And so as we come to it, like, what would be your one big takeaway? If you say, hey, you don't have time to listen to this whole podcast and you are a business owner or you are a leader in a corporation, what would you say is the one big takeaway? And Beverly, I'm going to start with you. What would you say this is the big thing that you should pay attention to from what we've discussed here today?
Wherever you're at, start. Whether it's internally for yourself on a personal journey so that you know the work you need to do within your organization or your company. This isn't a conversation to be had down the road. It isn't work to be done down the road. Whatever it is, put that foot first. Put the first step now. Like, take the step. You're fine. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be hard. But just do it, and you've begun.
I think it's important to humanize your people. It's important to humanize your employees. Your employees want to bring their entire selves to work. We all have a unique set of, cultural traits, beliefs, and values that we possess, and that doesn't just, fall off of us when you walk through the front door. I think there are tremendous benefits to embracing a culture of cultural competence and diversity, equity, and inclusion. If you truly care about customers, if you truly care about your employees, and I would dare say your customers and where those dollars are coming from, then this is something that I believe that should be a value of any corporation or organization. And it's just, personally, it's the right thing to do, I believe. We have a very diverse society, and you are not winning, but rather losing, I believe, if you aren't embracing these disciplines.
Right. And I think for me, you got to know where you are. So that means you need the data to tell you, and you need to know where you personally are, your leadership team is, and what's really the temperature of your organization. What is the cultural competency level? And then build from there, right? But having the information, I think employees get surveyed a lot. I don't know that I think all of the employee surveys are the right questions that they should be asking. This is one that you should. You really need to understand what the culture is of your organization. All right. Well, Beverly and Chris, this has just been fantastic, and what a great way to spend the morning. I want to thank you for joining me in the conference room today. It has been a pleasure having you both on the podcast.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for joining us for the Business of Race podcast. We ask that you follow us and click the subscribe button to make sure that you're updated every time a new podcast comes out. We'll see you next week in the conference room.